My name is Olivia Mercer, and I was born into a family where affection was a luxury and power was a weapon. My father, Senator William Mercer, was the kind of man who believed legacy mattered more than love. To him, people were not family. They were assets or liabilities. From the moment I came into the world, I was classified as the latter. He wanted a son to inherit his empire of influence, but instead, he got me. A daughter who reminded him that control could slip through bloodlines. Our home was a museum of silence. Every surface gleamed. Every room felt staged for photographs, not for living. My mother's laughter once softened it, but after she died, that sound disappeared, leaving behind an emptiness that echoed louder than any argument could. I was 10 when they lowered her casket into the ground, and even then, I knew something fundamental had shifted. My father didn't hold my hand. He just stared straight ahead, as if mourning was a weakness he couldn't afford. After her death, he sent me to a boarding school in Switzerland. He said it was to give me the best education, but I knew it was to keep me out of sight. In that cold, distant place, surrounded by strangers who measured worth through lineage, I learned the first law of survival. If no one gives you power, you take it. I studied obsessively, driven not by curiosity, but by defiance. My father may have erased me from his life, but I would write myself into history. It was during one of those long, sleepless nights in my dormitory, papers scattered across the desk, the glow of a single lamp flickering against the frost-covered window, that I first began to narrate my own story in my head. The pain, the loneliness, the fire quietly forming beneath everything. And now, years later, that same voice is speaking to you. If you're watching this, please hit the like button, tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from, and subscribe to this channel. Your support means more than you know, and sharing your own experiences helps remind people like me that we're not alone. Because the truth is, what I'm about to tell you isn't just about politics or power. It's about surviving the people who are supposed to protect you. It's about watching the ones you love turn into the ones who hurt you the most, and somehow finding the strength to keep standing when they expect you to fall. When I graduated at the top of my class, the school headmaster congratulated me in front of everyone. He said I was born to lead. I remember smiling politely, though deep down, I didn't feel like a leader yet. I felt like a storm waiting for permission to break. Every accomplishment, every award, every sleepless night was a small rebellion against the man who believed I would never be more than an inconvenience. Returning home at 22 was like stepping into a mausoleum. The mansion looked smaller than I remembered, though the air still smelled of expensive cigars and control. I realized then that what I had come back for wasn't his approval. It was my reckoning. That was the day I stopped being the daughter he never wanted and started becoming the woman he would never be able to destroy. When I returned home, my father's world felt colder than the winters I had endured abroad. He moved through politics like a chess player who saw every person as a piece to be moved, sacrificed, or removed entirely. I had grown up as one of those pieces, but now I was determined to become the player. He had built an empire that stretched from the marble floors of our mansion to the polished corridors of the Senate. Every handshake, every favor, every secret debt formed the architecture of his power. And though I was his blood, I was never meant to inherit it. He had molded an image of perfection through his second marriage, a glossy family portrait that erased me completely. His new wife smiled for cameras. His young stepson played the role of the perfect heir, and I stood at the edges of photographs, cropped by omission. But even from the shadows, I observed everything. I studied how influence flowed like invisible currency, how favors bought silence and secrets bought loyalty. I watched my father disguise corruption as charisma, manipulation as leadership. Every press conference, every public smile, every speech about moral duty was another mask in his endless performance. Behind it all, I saw the man who had sent his only daughter away because she reminded him of his failures. I joined the Mercer Foundation, one of his many public charities that existed more for optics than for impact. The foundation's marble lobby smelled of perfume and deceit. On the surface, it was about economic development and social reform. But beneath the slogans were offshore accounts, shell companies, and forged signatures. My father's empire was built not on vision, but on illusion. I spent months going through the numbers, cross-checking donations and budgets late into the night. The deeper I looked, the more rot I uncovered. Entire programs existed only on paper. Money meant for education had been redirected into political campaigns, and the faces of supposed beneficiaries were pulled from stock photos. At first, I tried to understand it through logic. Perhaps corruption was simply the price of ambition. Perhaps this was how real power worked. But each document I read, each signature I traced, made me feel like I was reading my own obituary. Every transaction carried his handwriting, his decisions, his fingerprints on decay. One evening, while reviewing yet another stack of reports, I realized that the foundation was not a charity at all. It was a fortress of deceit, constructed to protect him from accountability. I understood then that the empire he had built could not be reformed from within. It could only be dismantled. From that moment, I began to build a new kind of power. Quiet power. The kind that doesn't seek attention, only leverage. I gathered information, copied files, and memorized the patterns of his financial labyrinth. I became invisible again, but this time by design. The girl he had dismissed had returned as the woman studying the blueprint of his downfall. Still, there were moments when old wounds reopened. I would see his face on television, smiling beside his favored son, announcing new projects, speaking of family unity and shared vision. The world adored him. They saw a man of legacy, not the architect of manipulation. Watching him succeed made me burn, but it also reminded me of the truth. Appearances are only powerful until someone exposes what lies beneath them. I learned how easily admiration could be manufactured and how short-lived it became when the illusion cracked. That lesson would later define every decision I made. During those years, I also discovered the loneliness of ambition. People were drawn to the Mercer name, but not to me. I existed in a constant state of disguise, polite, composed, agreeable. Inside, I was constructing strategies, timelines, and escape routes. My heart had hardened into calculation. Every emotion was processed through reason, every memory through purpose. At 24, I looked around and realized that I was surrounded by ghosts. My mother's absence still haunted the hallways. My father's ambition filled the air like smoke. I had been born into an empire, but it was built on ashes. The only way to survive it was to let the fire consume everything false and rebuild from what remained. That year, I began to see myself not as a victim of his choices, but as the survivor of them. I understood that survival was its own form of rebellion. While others sought approval, I sought clarity. While they dreamed of inheriting power, I dreamed of redefining it. By the time the press began to question the Mercer Foundation's finances, I had already distanced myself from it quietly. The collapse would come, and with it, the first cracks in my father's perfect image. I would not be the one holding the torch, but I would be the spark. I learned then that revolutions rarely start with explosions. They start in silence, in the mind of someone who refuses to remain what they were told to be. And though I didn't yet know it, my silent rebellion had already begun. The daughter he had tried to erase was slowly becoming the woman who would one day rewrite history in her own name. The fall began quietly, the way most betrayals do. There was no confrontation, no outburst, no storm to signal the destruction that was coming. It arrived through carefully chosen headlines, anonymous leaks, and whispered accusations that spread faster than truth ever could. One morning, I was a respected analyst for my father's foundation. By nightfall, I was the face of a scandal I had never committed. The reports claimed I had falsified grant documents and embezzled funds. The evidence was fabricated, but expertly so. Emails I had never written, transactions I had never approved, witnesses who had never existed. I recognized the signature behind it all, not in ink, but in intent. My father's fingerprints were invisible, yet unmistakable. He had orchestrated this. It was his way of pruning his empire, removing the branch that grew in a direction he couldn't control. In politics, reputation is oxygen. Once it's gone, suffocation comes quickly. Within days, my name became synonymous with corruption. The same reporters who once praised my integrity now dissected my downfall with surgical precision. My phone stopped ringing. Invitations evaporated. Friends who had toasted my future avoided eye contact when we crossed paths in public. I tried, for a time, to fight the narrative. I filed statements, sent letters, sought meetings. But the silence on the other end was louder than any denial. The Mercer family had spoken, and the world believed them. The daughter was guilty, and the father was disappointed. It was a performance, one he had perfected through decades of manipulation. Eventually, the foundation dismissed me. The official statement called it a painful decision made in the interest of transparency. I read it alone in a dim apartment, my name typed neatly beneath words like ethical breach and internal failure. It was an elegant execution, no blood, no spectacle, just quiet erasure. Exile followed. It wasn't a geographical distance at first, but a moral one. Doors closed softly, conversations ended abruptly, and I became a ghost in the city where I had grown up. The Mercer name still opened every door for my father, but for me, it slammed them shut. Even the people who privately admitted they didn't believe the allegations kept their distance. Guilt by bloodline was still guilt enough. I left the capital under the cover of anonymity, renting a small room in a forgotten town hours away. The space smelled of dust and rain, the kind of place where no one asked questions and no one recognized faces. I learned to survive on what little I had saved, taking short-term freelance work that didn't require references. My world shrank to the size of that room and the flickering glow of the computer screen that kept me tethered to purpose. For a while, I lived in quiet disbelief. The enormity of what he had done sat in my chest like a stone I couldn't move. He hadn't just ruined my career, he had assassinated my identity. I had spent my entire life trying to prove I was worthy of his name, and now that name was the very thing crushing me. The irony was almost poetic. But pain, I learned, is a catalyst. It distills. It clarifies. It forces you to choose between despair and transformation. I decided that if I was going to be erased, I would rewrite myself. I began studying again, this time without the pressure of expectation. I devoured public records, government audits, and financial disclosures. I analyzed corruption cases across the country, tracing patterns that no one else had noticed. I taught myself investigative accounting and learned how power concealed itself behind bureaucracy. Each discovery ignited something inside me that I hadn't felt in years, a purpose beyond revenge, though revenge still pulsed quietly beneath it all. Isolation sharpened me. I no longer sought approval or validation. I existed for the work, for the truth, for the idea that one day I could expose what others were too afraid to name. I started keeping a journal, not of emotions, but of strategies. Each entry mapped the anatomy of my father's empire, the networks, the donors, the shell corporations. Piece by piece, I built an understanding of the machinery he operated. And buried within that machinery, I began to see the cracks. The town where I lived became my cocoon. I walked to the same cafe every morning, sat at the same corner table, and observed people who had no idea who I was. There was something humbling in their simplicity. They cared about rent, family, weather, not politics or legacy. They lived lives untainted by the hunger for power that had poisoned mine. Watching them grounded me. It reminded me of what my father had forgotten. Power without empathy is rot disguised as gold. Months turned into a year. The scandal that had defined me faded from the news cycle, replaced by fresher outrages. But while the world moved on, I did not. I spent every waking hour transforming my humiliation into discipline. My anger became structure. My silence became strategy. I learned that patience is not weakness. It is stored strength. I knew I could never confront my father directly, not yet. His reach was too wide, his influence too deep. But empires, even the strongest, are always rotting from within. All I had to do was wait for the right moment and be ready when it came. There were nights when I lay awake listening to the rain against the window, wondering what it would feel like to face him again. Would he see the same daughter he discarded, or would he see what he had created? Something colder, sharper, stronger. I didn't know then that this exile was not punishment. It was preparation. In losing everything, I had gained something my father could never understand: freedom. Freedom from his approval, from his expectations, from the illusion that blood defined destiny. I was no longer his daughter in any sense that mattered. I had become my own architect, and the foundation I would build would not crumble under his name. The exile of a daughter was complete, but in that quiet ruin, a leader was being born. Exile stripped me down to my bare essence. Without reputation, wealth, or name, I was forced to meet the version of myself that existed beneath everything I had once believed defined me. The first months were filled with disorientation, a numb rhythm of survival. Days bled into nights. Meals were plain, thoughts repetitive, and silence constant. At first, that silence frightened me. Then, slowly, it began to shape me. When all distractions vanish, truth becomes deafening. The truth was that I had spent my entire life orbiting my father's shadow, trying to earn, resist, or destroy it. Now that shadow no longer reached me. It felt like stepping out of a storm into an unfamiliar calm. But calmness is not peace. It is a mirror, and I was forced to look. I started to walk every morning through the cracked streets of the small town I now called home. The simplicity of other people's lives fascinated me. Shopkeepers opened their doors, mothers hurried children to school, and men sat outside cafes arguing about soccer and weather. They were anonymous, but real. There was no audience, no campaign, no hidden agenda. Watching them became my education in humility. For the first time, I understood what an authentic life looked like, one built not on ambition, but on connection. Yet ambition never leaves quietly. It lingers like a fever, waiting for a new direction. I began to channel mine into study. The local library became my sanctuary. I spent hours tracing the architecture of systems, the way laws are written, the methods used to hide funds, the gaps that allow corruption to thrive. My exile became a classroom, and every discovery felt like reclaiming a piece of the power I had lost. At night, I worked freelance for small businesses, auditing their records or drafting reports for modest pay. Numbers became my comfort again. They were pure, unemotional, exact. They gave me a sense of order in a world that had rejected me. Each invoice I completed, each formula I solved, rebuilt the confidence that the scandal had shattered. It was during one of those long nights that I realized I was no longer angry, at least not in the way I once had been. The rage that once burned so brightly had cooled into something steadier. Focus. Anger consumes. Focus constructs. I stopped fantasizing about revenge and began to think in terms of reconstruction. I didn't want to destroy my father anymore. I wanted to outlast him. Months turned into a year. My small room transformed into an office lined with books, reports, and scribbled notes. I filled entire notebooks with observations about government inefficiency and private sector collusion. I saw patterns that others ignored because I knew where to look. Corruption wasn't just an action, it was an ecosystem, and my father was only one of its many architects. Understanding that changed everything. The more I learned, the more I began to imagine a different kind of power. Not one gained through manipulation or inherited privilege, but one earned through knowledge and discipline. I started to see myself not as a victim of a dynasty, but as the seed of its undoing. My life's destruction had given me an unparalleled education in how systems fail, and perhaps how they could be rebuilt. I saved every cent I earned, and eventually, I was able to buy a second-hand computer that didn't overheat after an hour. With it, I began compiling a database: public records, leaked reports, donor histories, budget discrepancies. I didn't yet know what I was building, only that it mattered. The project became my purpose, and with purpose came a sense of quiet power. There were still nights when loneliness returned, curling around me like smoke. I missed human voices, laughter, the comfort of being understood. But I also recognized that solitude was a forge. Every hour spent alone was a kind of purification. In silence, there were no lies, no manipulation, no expectations. There was only the truth of my own endurance. Over time, I stopped measuring progress in material terms. Instead, I measured it in strength, the ability to wake up each day and continue, even when no one was watching. My father's empire had been built on appearance. Mine was being built on invisibility. His required applause. Mine required silence. And in that silence, I was learning a form of power that could not be taken away. By the end of my second year in exile, I no longer introduced myself with hesitation. The name Mercer still carried poison, but it no longer defined me. I was becoming something entirely new, someone independent, deliberate, unbreakable. Looking back now, I realized that exile wasn't my punishment. It was my transformation. It stripped away everything superficial and revealed what remained when reputation and inheritance disappeared. Will, that silence, once unbearable, had forged me into something stronger than rage, sharper than grief, and far more dangerous than ambition. It had turned me into someone my father could no longer recognize, and someone the world would one day have no choice but to see. Years passed before I realized I no longer felt afraid of my own name. The scandal that had once destroyed me had faded into a forgotten headline, replaced by newer tragedies and fresher controversies. My father's world continued to turn, louder, glossier, but shakier than before. He was still revered by many, feared by others, and untouchable in his own mind. But I knew the truth. Every empire begins to rot from its foundation long before it collapses in public. By the time I returned to the capital, I was no longer the same woman he had exiled. I had built myself in silence, piece by piece, through study, patience, and work that demanded precision. I had learned to walk without being seen and to listen without being heard. I had turned invisibility into a skill. That was how I came back, quietly, without announcement, without ceremony. The city was both familiar and foreign. Its skyline shimmered with ambition. Its streets pulsed with the same hypocrisy I had once fled from. Everywhere I looked, I saw the ghosts of what had been. The avenue where I used to wait for my driver. The restaurant where my father had hosted his donors. The newspaper office that had printed my disgrace. Each place felt smaller than memory had painted it, as if success had inflated them beyond their true size. I rented a modest apartment near the old financial district, close enough to observe but far enough to remain unnoticed. My goal wasn't revenge, it was understanding. I wanted to see the system not through the lens of the wounded daughter, but through the eyes of the strategist I had become. The first step was information. Using my background in auditing, I began offering consulting services to small nonprofits struggling to meet compliance standards. The work was honest, necessary, and allowed me to access networks that brushed against my father's circle without entering it directly. I learned how his political allies disguised bribes as donations, how public contracts were rerouted through shell companies, and how the same handful of families recycled power between them like a private currency. I mapped it all, not with anger, but with precision. In that web of deceit, I began to identify fractures, disgruntled partners, fading loyalties, insiders who whispered about missing funds and growing debts. I started gathering documents quietly, sometimes through public records, sometimes through those who didn't realize what they were giving me. I didn't need to fabricate evidence. The truth was damning enough. One day, while reviewing campaign finance reports, I found what I had been waiting for: a discrepancy linking the Mercer Foundation to an offshore account used to funnel illegal donations. The numbers didn't lie. They were my father's handwriting written in digital ink. For years, he had hidden corruption behind the illusion of philanthropy. Now, the very system he had taught me to fear was providing the evidence I needed to expose him. But I didn't act immediately. I had learned patience from pain. Instead of rushing forward, I built context. I traced the money through every layer until the network was undeniable. Then I reached out anonymously to a journalist known for his integrity. I sent the documents through encrypted channels. No signature, no trace. I watched from my apartment as the first headlines appeared, small at first, then growing louder, feeding on public outrage. The Mercer name, once untouchable, began to tremble. News anchors speculated, analysts dissected, and the same voices that had once worshipped him now questioned his ethics. My father denied everything, of course, but denial only amplified suspicion. For the first time in my life, I watched him fight a battle he couldn't fully control. The irony was not lost on me. He had destroyed me with lies, and I was destroying him with truth. But as his world began to unravel, I didn't feel the satisfaction I had imagined. What I felt instead was distance, a recognition that I no longer belonged to the same world he did. As the investigation deepened, my father's allies turned on each other. Contracts were frozen, accounts seized, partnerships severed. The once flawless empire began to crack under the weight of its own deception. And though I had been the invisible hand that guided the first spark, I remained in the shadows. There was no victory parade, no public vindication, only quiet confirmation that justice had begun to move. In the stillness of my apartment, I realized something profound. I didn't need the world to know what I had done. My father had built his life on the need to be seen, to be admired, to be feared. But my power existed in anonymity. It was cleaner, sharper, untainted by ego. I had returned to the city as a ghost, and ghosts don't seek applause. They haunt. They remind the living of what they've buried. The fall of the Mercer Empire had begun, and the daughter he had once erased was now the invisible force writing the next chapter of its legacy. The destruction of my father's empire did not come with a single explosion, but rather a slow implosion, collapsing inward like a dying star. It began with silence, the kind that follows denial, the pause between accusation and consequence. The headlines spread like wildfire, but he refused to acknowledge them. For a time, it almost seemed as if he would survive it, as if the weight of his reputation could hold the truth beneath the surface. But lies, I had learned, are like gas leaks, invisible until they ignite. From my small apartment, I watched the news in fragments. The journalists I had once feared now spoke his name with suspicion, their voices lined with careful curiosity. At first, they tiptoed around the subject, calling it unverified, under investigation, or politically motivated. But the evidence was too precise, the trail too direct. Within weeks, what began as rumor became scandal. The Mercer Foundation, once a symbol of benevolence, was now synonymous with corruption and deceit. The public unraveling was both mesmerizing and painful. He had built his identity on control, of people, of narratives, of perception. And now that control was slipping from his grasp. Watching him deny, deflect, and attempt to manipulate the media was like watching an actor forget his lines in front of a live audience. I knew the choreography too well. I had once been part of that performance. But now, I was in the audience, and I didn't clap. Each new revelation brought him closer to ruin. The offshore accounts were traced, the shell companies exposed, the false beneficiaries identified. Politicians who had once aligned themselves with him began to distance quietly, removing his name from events, avoiding his calls. Loyalty, I realized, is only as strong as power's currency, and his reserves were running out. Yet, amid the chaos, I felt no triumph. I thought I would feel vindicated, perhaps even joyful, but all I felt was a strange stillness. The man on the television was no longer my father, not because he had changed, but because I finally saw him without illusion. He wasn't a villain in a grand tragedy or a mastermind fallen from grace. He was small, fragile, hollow. A man who had mistaken fear for leadership and applause for love. The scandal spread beyond the foundation. Investigators began examining his real estate holdings, his campaign finances, even the contracts signed during his time in office. Each layer peeled back revealed another darker truth. I watched interviews with former staffers who described years of manipulation, intimidation, and fraud. They spoke of the pressure to falsify numbers, of the threats that came when questions were asked. Their words echoed experiences I knew too well. For the first time, I wasn't alone in knowing the truth. When his second wife filed for divorce, the tabloids treated it like spectacle. They published photos of her leaving their mansion with boxes and bodyguards. They speculated about affairs, assets, and betrayal. But I knew it wasn't about romance. It was about survival. She had seen the ship sinking and had chosen to swim before the water reached her neck. Then came the moment I hadn't anticipated, his televised address. I hadn't planned to watch it, but curiosity won. He stood behind a podium, thinner, paler, his usual arrogance replaced by exhaustion. He spoke about attacks on his character and political enemies trying to destroy him. He denied wrongdoing, invoked family values, and thanked those who remained loyal. It was a masterclass in deflection, but his voice betrayed him. It trembled. His eyes darted away from the camera too often. The image of that man, once so untouchable, collapsing beneath the weight of his own lies, should have satisfied me. Instead, I turned off the screen halfway through. I didn't need to see the end of his speech. I had already lived through his downfall once before. The public was merely catching up. In the weeks that followed, legal actions mounted. Investigators raided offices, froze accounts, and subpoenaed records. The Mercer name, once a shield, became a liability. I received messages from old acquaintances, some pretending concern, others fishing for information. I ignored them all. My role in his fall was invisible, and I wanted it to remain that way. My satisfaction came from distance, from knowing I had acted with precision and restraint. I sometimes wondered if he suspected me, if he looked at the evidence and recognized my style, the methodical tracing, the careful timing, the lack of emotion. But even if he did, he would never admit it. To do so would mean acknowledging that his daughter had learned his strategies better than he ever did. His decline accelerated. The Senate stripped him of privileges, donors withdrew support, and his name disappeared from every gala and committee that had once depended on his influence. Even the mansion, that cathedral of control, was put up for sale. He retreated from public view, his statements reduced to legal press releases written by aides who no longer believed in him. When the news broke that he had been formally charged with financial crimes, I sat in silence for a long time. The television flickered against the walls of my small apartment, and I realized that this was the moment I had imagined countless times. Yet it didn't feel like victory. It felt like closure. A chapter ending not with celebration, but with quiet inevitability. His downfall didn't erase the years of manipulation, the loneliness, the exile. It didn't undo the scars of his control, but it did free me from his shadow. I no longer needed to fight him. He had defeated himself. I had simply illuminated the path. In the quiet that followed, I felt the faint stirrings of something new. a kind of peace I had never known. It wasn't forgiveness, but understanding. He had been my greatest teacher, though he never meant to be. From him, I had learned how power corrupts, how fear spreads, and how control suffocates. But from surviving him, I had learned something far greater: how to rebuild without becoming what destroyed you. The fall of the king was complete. But for the first time, I saw that his kingdom had never truly been mine to lose. The ashes he left behind were simply the soil from which I would rise. When my father's empire finally collapsed, it left behind a vacuum, an empty space where fear had once dictated everything. The people who had built their careers around his name scrambled to distance themselves, their loyalty dissolving faster than the ink on his old contracts. Yet amid the chaos, something unexpected happened. My name resurfaced, quietly at first, then louder. The same media that had once labeled me a disgrace now whispered about redemption, irony, and legacy. I had no intention of stepping back into the public eye. For years, I had built a life defined by anonymity. I valued control, silence, and distance. But influence, once understood, never truly leaves you. The same curiosity that had once driven me to uncover my father's corruption now turned towards something greater. I wanted to understand not just how power destroys, but how it could be rebuilt differently. It began with small invitations: academic conferences, policy discussions, public panels about ethics in governance. I accepted the first one almost by accident, thinking it would be an isolated event. But that single appearance set off a chain reaction. People wanted to hear the woman who had survived the Mercer scandal and refused to vanish. I spoke not as a victim, but as a witness to a broken system. My words carried weight, not because of eloquence, but because they were forged in lived experience. The audiences grew. Reporters asked for interviews I declined. My refusal only made them more interested. In a country weary of polished politicians, my silence became authenticity. I spoke rarely but with precision, and each time I did, people listened. I had become something unexpected, an outsider who embodied the credibility that insiders had long lost. Eventually, an independent civic movement approached me. They were young, idealistic, disillusioned with traditional parties. They believed in transparency, education, and accountability, concepts my father had treated as obstacles. They wanted me to advise them, not as a figurehead, but as a strategist. I hesitated for weeks before saying yes. It wasn't ambition that drove me. It was curiosity. Could power exist without corruption? Could leadership serve rather than consume? Working with them reignited something I hadn't felt in years: a sense of belonging. The group was small but determined, driven by genuine hope rather than greed. We worked in cramped offices with peeling paint and secondhand furniture, drafting policy proposals late into the night. There were no cameras, no luxury, no applause, only purpose. For the first time, I saw politics not as a weapon, but as a tool that could repair instead of destroy. As our movement grew, the media began to notice. They called us naive, inexperienced, and doomed to fail. But their cynicism only fueled us. People wanted change, and we gave them something different: truth. I spoke at rallies not from a podium, but from among the crowd, standing shoulder to shoulder with those who believed that decency could still win. Each event felt like a mirror held to my past, the daughter of a fallen king, now walking among those who had once been ignored by his empire. It was during this period that I began to sense a quiet inevitability forming around me. Others saw leadership where I saw resilience. They spoke of potential candidacy, of elections, of public office. I resisted at first. The idea of returning to the same arena that had once destroyed me seemed masochistic. But the more I watched the political landscape crumble, the more I realized that stepping back wasn't an act of humility. It was surrender. The decision came not from ego, but from clarity. I had survived the worst kind of corruption, not in the system, but in the bloodline. If I could navigate that and still believe in integrity, perhaps I could offer something real. I announced my candidacy for a legislative seat as an independent, refusing donations from corporations or old political families. The experts laughed. They said I had no structure, no party, no chance. But I had something they didn't. Authenticity born from ruin. The campaign was relentless. I traveled from small towns to crowded cities, speaking to people face to face, listening more than I spoke. My story spread organically, carried by those who saw themselves in my struggle. The woman once branded as corrupt had become a symbol of survival. I didn't promise miracles. I promised honesty. And in a nation drowning in deceit, that was revolutionary enough. On election night, I didn't expect to win. But as results came in, the impossible happened. District after district turned in my favor. By midnight, the screen flashed the final numbers, and I realized I had become what my father had never believed I could be. Chosen by the people, not manufactured by power. The rise of the outsider had begun, not through vengeance or legacy, but through truth. I hadn't inherited an empire. I had built a movement. And for the first time, I understood what real victory felt like. It wasn't about defeating him. It was about proving that survival itself could be the most radical form of power. Victory changes nothing at first. It only reveals who you already are. When the results confirmed my election, I didn't feel elation or pride. I felt a strange, quiet certainty, as if all the paths I had taken, every wound, every betrayal, had converged exactly where they were meant to. But beneath that calm was something heavier, the weight of legacy. The Mercer name still followed me like a ghost, even though I no longer spoke it aloud. To the public, I was Olivia Duarte, independent candidate, reformist outsider. But to those who knew the past, I was still his daughter. The press reminded the world of that every chance they got. My first months in office were like walking through a minefield. Politics was not designed for truth-tellers. Every handshake had layers of intent, every promise a hidden clause. I had entered a system built by men like my father, crafted to protect greed, not governance. I understood that now, and perhaps that understanding was my greatest strength. I knew how to read corruption, because I had been raised by it. The other legislators regarded me with cautious curiosity. Some saw a threat, others saw opportunity. They didn't understand how someone without a powerful party or corporate backing had managed to win. I didn't fit their design, and what doesn't fit cannot be controlled. That was my advantage. I sat through endless meetings where decisions were made before anyone entered the room, where budgets were negotiated not by ethics but by alliances. Every day I felt the shadow of my father whispering through the walls of that institution, the same voice that had shaped it, the same ambition that had corrupted it. In those early months, I made mistakes. I trusted the wrong people, believed in promises too easily. I learned quickly that good intentions were a language few understood in politics. Yet each betrayal refined me. I grew quieter, more observant, more precise. I no longer fought for recognition. I fought for results. I used data like armor, preparation as weaponry. I built credibility not through speeches, but through consistency. The same media that had once hunted me began to shift its tone. They called me disciplined, relentless, and unexpectedly effective. I focused on legislation that targeted the kind of corruption my father had thrived in. Transparency in public spending, oversight on campaign donations, audits of charitable foundations. Each proposal felt like a piece of justice, small but deliberate. I knew that one law couldn't undo decades of deceit, but every change, every reform, was a stone laid in the foundation of something new. There were moments, though, when I felt his presence too strongly. Walking through the marble corridors where his voice had once echoed, I would remember the grandeur he loved so much. The cameras, the applause, the illusion of control. I moved differently through those same halls. I didn't crave admiration. I sought accountability. But I couldn't escape the knowledge that the institution itself had been designed to favor people like him. Every reform I introduced was an act of rebellion against the world that had once destroyed me. The public saw only my composure. They didn't see the nights I spent in my office long after everyone had gone home, reading draft after draft of proposals, tracing every loophole, terrified of repeating the mistakes of those who came before me. They didn't see the exhaustion, the loneliness, the unspoken question that haunted me. Had I become too much like him in my pursuit of being nothing like him? Power, even when earned, is still dangerous. It reshapes you quietly, convincing you that your will is righteous, that your control is necessary. I guarded myself against that temptation more fiercely than any political opponent. As months turned into years, my reputation grew. My policies began to influence real change, small, measurable victories that reached beyond symbolism. I built alliances with those who valued principle over power, though we were few. My office became known as a place where honesty was expected, where documentation mattered more than loyalty. It was not glamorous work, but it was clean. For the first time in decades, the people began to see politics not as spectacle, but as service. Still, the Mercer name refused to die completely. Every article that mentioned my achievements carried an asterisk. The daughter of the disgraced senator. It was as if my bloodline could never be separated from my identity. But I learned to turn that shadow into fuel. If the world insisted on remembering him, then I would make sure they also remembered what came after him. By the end of my first term, I no longer felt like an outsider. I felt like an infiltrator, someone who had entered the system not to belong to it, but to change it from within. The daughter of corruption had become the architect of integrity. Looking back now, I realize that redemption is not about erasing where you come from. It's about transforming it. My father's legacy had been built on manipulation and fear. Mine would be built on endurance. He had used power to dominate. I would use it to rebuild. The shadow of legacy never truly disappears, but light does not need to destroy darkness. It only needs to outlast it. And I was prepared to outlast everything. The idea of running for president began as a whisper, something others said about me long before I ever allowed myself to believe it. I had never sought the spotlight, but in politics, silence can be mistaken for virtue and restraint for leadership. After years of steady work and quiet victories, the public began to see me not as an anomaly, but as a possibility. The outsider had become the only name untainted by scandal, the rare figure who seemed untouched by the machinery of deceit. I did not chase the title. The country offered it to me. When I finally decided to run, I knew the campaign would not be about policy alone. It would be about survival, truth, and memory. My father's downfall still lingered in the collective consciousness. His corruption had scarred the nation, and my bloodline carried the residue of that betrayal. I could not erase it, so I embraced it. I told the world, through actions more than words, that I had lived through the rot, studied it, and vowed never to let it grow again. The months that followed were brutal. My opponents had entire parties behind them, while I stood alone, armed only with integrity and persistence. They called me inexperienced, arrogant, naive. They resurrected every rumor from my past, twisted every fact into a weapon. The media replayed footage of my father's trials beside my speeches, as if his sins were hereditary. Each night, I watched myself dissected on screens, my expression slowed, my pauses analyzed, my history rewritten by people who had never lived a day of it. But what they failed to understand was that I had been forged in humiliation. I had already endured public disgrace once and survived it. I knew how to outlast noise. The same resilience that had carried me through exile now sustained me through the firestorm of politics. Every insult became fuel. Every attack proved that my presence threatened the order they were desperate to preserve. I built my campaign not on promises, but on transparency. My platform was simple: accountability, reform, truth. I refused corporate donations, refused to trade favors, refused to bow to the power brokers who tried to buy influence behind closed doors. My rallies were small at first, gatherings of ordinary people rather than elites. I looked into their faces and saw what my father had ignored: weariness, distrust, and hunger for something real. Their faith in me grew, not because I offered perfection, but because I offered honesty. The movement swelled quietly, spreading through neighborhoods, campuses, factories, and forgotten towns. My name began appearing on handmade posters and handwritten signs, carried by those who felt unseen. I didn't need to convince them I was different. They already knew. The daughter of corruption had become the messenger of reform. As the election neared, the attacks intensified. My opponents unleashed a campaign designed to break me. They forged documents, resurrected old footage, and accused me of hypocrisy. They whispered that I was merely a rebranded version of my father, a clever manipulation of public guilt. They underestimated how deeply I had studied human behavior. Lies are easy to spread but difficult to sustain. I didn't fight their falsehoods with outrage. I fought them with patience. I waited for truth to do its quiet work. In debates, I refused to shout. I spoke slowly, measuredly, each word deliberate. I didn't perform, I explained. I didn't appeal to emotion. I appealed to conscience. I reminded people what leadership should feel like: steady, not theatrical. And to my surprise, that calmness resonated more powerfully than any slogan. In a world addicted to noise, stillness became my revolution. The final weeks of the campaign were suffocating. Sleep became rare, food tasteless, time elastic. I traveled across the country, shaking hands that trembled with hope, listening to stories of despair that mirrored my own past. I saw mothers who worked 2 jobs, students drowning in debt, elderly men who still believed change was possible. I carried their voices with me like invisible armor. I wasn't running for power. I was running to give their pain meaning. Election day arrived with heavy clouds. I spent the morning in solitude, watching the sunrise paint the horizon in shades of gold and ash. No matter the outcome, I knew I had already won something greater than office. I had reclaimed my name. The hours passed in agonizing stillness as votes were counted. Early projections placed me behind, then tied, then ahead. The nation held its breath. When the final results appeared, the screen glowed with numbers I could barely comprehend. Victory. The word didn't feel triumphant. It felt inevitable. Every humiliation, every exile, every wound had led to this moment. The people had chosen the one who had once been erased. That night, I stood before the crowd and saw faces illuminated not by spectacle but by belief. The chants, the tears, the unity. They weren't celebrating me. They were celebrating the possibility that something broken could still be repaired. As confetti fell and lights burned overhead, I realized that this was not the culmination of my story, but its transformation. I had inherited ruin and turned it into redemption. I had been buried under my father's shadow and had risen beyond its reach. The election of fire had not consumed me, it had refined me. I understood now that leadership was not about being followed. It was about standing where no one else dares and lighting the way. And in that fire, I was reborn. The morning of my inauguration felt unreal, as if the world had momentarily paused to let me catch up with it. The sky above the Capitol was washed in pale gold, a sunrise sharp enough to make the marble buildings glow. I stood behind the podium that had once belonged to men like my father. Men who believed power was inheritance, not responsibility. As I looked out across the endless sea of people, I realized how far I had traveled from the silence of exile to this moment. Every humiliation, every betrayal, Every long night of doubt had led me here. The weight of it settled over me not like a burden, but like armor. There were no tears, no trembling hands. I had cried all the tears I had to give in other years, when I was invisible, when I had nothing but resolve. What remained now was a steady calm. I could hear the distant hum of the crowd, the rhythmic snapping of flags in the wind, the faint echo of my own heartbeat reminding me that I was still human beneath the history. When I raised my hand to take the oath, I did not think of victory. I thought of survival. I thought of the long road between who I had been and who I had become. I thought of my father, his empire, his arrogance, his belief that he was untouchable. He had spent a lifetime building walls of influence around himself, but I had built something stronger in silence, credibility. He ruled through intimidation. I would govern through endurance. In that instant, I understood that true leadership was not about command. It was about conviction. As the final words of the oath left my lips, the air shifted. Applause swelled, cameras flashed, and for a brief second, the sound blurred into a single note of pure, overwhelming clarity. I had become the president he could never be, not because I had more power, but because I had learned what to do without it. Power had destroyed him. It had refined me. The first days in office were a whirlwind of movement. Advisors, briefings, security briefings, endless meetings with people who seemed to speak in a language made entirely of caution and strategy. They treated me as both symbol and anomaly, the president who had risen from disgrace, the woman who carried both the shame and redemption of a nation. But beneath their polished words, I saw the same machinery I had spent years studying, the slow, grinding gears of bureaucracy and ambition. Change, I quickly learned, was not declared. It was built, one decision at a time. I worked quietly, as I always had. Transparency became not a slogan, but a practice. Every contract, every reform, every appointment was made public. I invited oversight, knowing that scrutiny was not the enemy of integrity. In the beginning, it unsettled many. People accustomed to secrecy found themselves exposed to light. The same lobbyists who once fed on corruption now struggled to breathe in a world where influence had to justify itself. Progress was slow, resisted at every turn, but steady. In the solitude of the presidential residence, I often found myself staring at the framed photographs of leaders who had come before me. Some had left legacies of progress, others of ruin. Each had carried their own illusions of control. I understood now how seductive those illusions were. Power is a mirror. It reflects your truest self back at you, amplified. My father had seen only dominance in that reflection, and it had consumed him. I saw fragility, and I embraced it. The nights were hardest. In the quiet hours, long after the meetings had ended and the lights in the palace had dimmed, memories returned like ghosts I could never fully banish. The image of him at the breakfast table, sliding papers toward me, the scalding heat of betrayal, the coffee that had burned not just my skin, but the last thread of filial trust. Even now, I could almost feel that sting when I closed my eyes. It had taken years to understand that his cruelty had not been personal. It had been the only language he knew. Power had taught him to hurt what he could not control. I sometimes wondered what he would think if he could see me now. Would he feel pride, envy, rage? Or would he even recognize the woman standing in the place he had always believed belonged to him? I would never know. He was gone before my campaign began. Gone without apology, without reconciliation. His death was as theatrical as his life. A collapse in the middle of a speech about loyalty. When the news reached me, I felt nothing. Not grief, not relief. Only a quiet understanding that the story we shared had finally ended. Yet even in death, he remained my greatest teacher. Every day I spent in power reminded me of the cost of arrogance. I refused to repeat his mistakes. I surrounded myself not with sycophants, but with skeptics. People who questioned me, challenged me, forced me to justify every choice. Leadership, I realized, is not about certainty. It is about the courage to admit when you are wrong and the discipline to act when you are right. Outside, the world began to change. Slowly, the cynicism that had defined public life began to erode. Citizens started to believe in institutions again. Transparency bred trust, and trust bred participation. Young people entered politics for the right reasons, no longer viewing integrity as weakness. Watching that transformation was the closest I had ever come to peace. It was the proof that pain, when endured with purpose, could build something beautiful. 1 year into my presidency, I visited the town where I had lived in exile. The small library was still there, the one where I had sat for hours tracing the patterns of corruption that had once ruled my life. The same woman at the desk recognized me, though she said nothing. She simply nodded and returned to her work, as if to remind me that some parts of the world continue quietly regardless of power's theatrics. Standing there, surrounded by dust and silence, I realized that this place had shaped me more than any institution ever could. It had taught me the power of solitude, the strength of patience, and the value of starting again. Now, years later, when I look back at that long journey, I understand that destiny is rarely grand at the beginning. It is small, fragile, hidden beneath humiliation and loss. It grows in the quiet, in the places where no one is watching. That is where leaders are truly made. Not in the spotlight, but in the shadows they have survived. My father once believed power was inherited. I learned that it is earned, moment by moment, choice by choice, truth by truth. His legacy was built on fear. Mine was born from its ashes. He tried to rule a nation through control. I learned to lead one through empathy. As I stand beneath the same golden light that once crowned my inauguration, I know this much is true. The greatest revenge is not to destroy what hurt you, but to become everything it said you could never be. I am Olivia Mercer, the president he could never be. And my story began the day he tried to end it.